Hi everyone, welcome to Nithrania Game Club. My name is Branislav Berec and today we have a preview for you, a preview for the game called Myraclia, which is going to be on Kickstarter in this September, early September. It's designed by Rudy Priecinski, who has already successfully delivered one Kickstarter project, and it was for his first game called Envira, which was a small family type of game. Myraclia is his second game, bigger, more complex, a game for 2 to 5 players, medium weight strategy game, which plays in about 45 to 60 minutes. Myraclia is the name of the planet, which is represented by these hexes, but the planet is inhabitable, that's why all those hexes are black and there's no life, but the Myraclia has all these divine elements, and if these elements are combined in a specific way, they can terraform and turn this land into beautiful forests and plains and mountains and rivers and so on and so forth. Myraclia is played in rounds, and each round has two phases, the drafting phase and terraforming phase. In the drafting phase, players draft these elements, which they then use in the terraforming phase to terraform tiles and get victory points. The drafting phase in this game is very interesting, very unique. It's the heart of the game, because when players think about their next selection, their next pick, they need to think about several things at the same time. First of all, they need to think about what tiles they want to terraform. This is actually dependent on their strategy, and the strategy depends on the final scoring, which allows players to pursue different strategies. Second thing is what will be their player order in the terraforming phase, because player order in this game is really important. So let me explain how this drafting phase works. First of all, there are 5 elements per player randomly drawn from the bag for each drafting phase. The color of these cubes represents the different types of elements and also their rarity. The green element, which is earth, is the most common element because it has 21 cubes in the game. However, there's only 9 black or white elements in the game. The distribution of these elements on the drafting board depends on the number of cubes from each element drawn for this drafting phase. Starting with the first player and following this drafting order, each player will draft one element. So let's say the first player would decide to pick the red element. He would need to place one of his smaller player discs to the first available position in the same column from which he drafted the element. Then it's the next player's turn, and let's say he would choose this yellow element, and he would also place his small marker to the same column. Now, if the third player would choose, let's say, this red element, because there is already another player marker, he would place his disc to the next available spot. And now, here's the trick. From now on, we follow the same drafting order again and again and again. On a player's turn, if the player would decide to choose an element from the same column or from any column to the right of the current position of his player marker, let's say he would choose this green element, his player marker would stay where it is. However, if instead they would choose any element to the left of the current position of their player marker, let's say this orange element, they have to move their player discs to the first available spot in the same column from which they drafted the element. So if the players would decide to draft these rare elements, they can only do it by moving their disc to that particular column. And what's wrong with that? Well, if you look at this terraforming order, it starts over here in this spot and follows this line, which means that for the next terraforming phase, the player whose player marker is the closest to this particular spot will go first in this terraforming phase. Then the next player and the next player, and so on and so forth. So the player picking these very rare elements will probably go last in that terraforming phase. As I already said, the player order during the terraforming phase is very important in this game, because even if you draft this rare element and you hope to terraform a specific tile with this rare element, but you are last in the terraforming order, by the time it's your turn, that tile may not be even available for you, so that rare element will be useless for you. And that's the beauty of this drafting phase. Players always need to balance between what elements they're drafting how rare elements they're drafting, but also their position for the next terraforming phase. Now, if you don't want to draft these special rare elements because you don't want to worsen your position, and let's say all these elements would have been drafted already, players would have the option to pass. That's marked by turning their player marker upside down, and those players do not take part in this drafting phase any longer. Other players may still continue to draft remaining elements. If all players would decide to pass, or if all the elements would be drafted, the drafting phase is over, and then we continue to the terraforming phase. The first thing you have to do in the terraforming phase is to define the terraforming order. So this player would go first, this would be the second player, and this is the third one. Now in this terraforming phase, starting with the first player and then following this terraforming order, each player takes the full turn before the next player takes his full turn. During their turns in the terraforming phase, players can do maximum 3 actions, and they can either fully terraform the tile, or they can use another special cool feature of this game, and they can just reserve the tile. Now let's take a closer look at both options. To fully terraform the tile, the player needs to spend all the elements depicted on that particular tile. So in this case, 2 orange and 1 green element. The player has to take these elements from his own personal reserve, and then those elements would be discarded. And by the way, the game comes with this beautiful wooden plate for all the elements that are discarded during the game. Then the player would mark that tile with his own player disc, the large disc, and then score those 2 victory points depicted on the tile. Those victory points are marked on this scoring board. So it was the first action of this player, and for the second action, if he would have sufficient elements, he would be able to terraform any adjacent tile. Now, he doesn't have all the required elements, but let's pretend he has this black element. He can now terraform this tile. He needs to spend black, red, and yellow. And this yellow square means that this tile would provide the yellow element immediately, and then for all other subsequent rounds as well. Then the player would score 2 victory points for this tile, and after flipping the tile to its terraformed side and placing the player marker on it, any other adjacent tile that has been already terraformed would also score victory points. Not just the tiles that belong to this particular player, but let's say another player would already have this tile terraformed. If this tile would be scored, all these adjacent tiles would also score victory points. So by terraforming a tile, player can actually provide victory points for his opponents. The second option during the player's turn in the terraforming phase is the reservation. Players can reserve the tile in case they don't have all the required elements for the full terraformation, but they have at least some of those elements. So in that case, they don't fully terraform it, they simply reserve it. So in our example, the player doesn't have this black element, but he has red and yellow. So he can take these 2 elements, place them on this tile, and he would lose 1 point for 1 missing element. Now the player would take one of his player discs and place it with the dark side up to mark that this tile is reserved. At any time during the game, each player can have maximum 1 tile reserved. Players can fully terraform these reserved tiles anytime later in the game by adding those missing elements, but until then, no one else can reserve that tile, no one else can terraform the tile, and that's why it's such a strategic element of this game, because even if you don't have that rare element required, but the other players have that element, but they are still going to take their turn in the terraforming phase, you can reserve that tile and you can block them from terraforming that tile. That's why the position in the terraforming order is so important in this game. At the end of the player's turn, if the player has any unused elements, those elements will be discarded at the end of the round. However, until then, they are placed into this exchange zone. This exchange zone is another cool feature of this game, which adds another level to the interactivity, because all these elements in the exchange zones of all the players who have already finished their turn are available for all players who are still going to take their turn in the terraforming phase. And by being available, I mean those players can, the players who are still going to take their turn, they can swap those elements one to one. So they cannot grab them and add more cubes to their reserve, they can simply swap them, so they have more colors available. The very last thing players need to do at the end of their turn is to add more tiles to the game board. For each player disc placed on the game board this turn, players need to add one more tile to the game board. So for 2 discs, 2 more tiles are added. And this is the way how the game board expands over the course of the game. At the end of the round, when all players have taken their turns, all the unused elements are discarded. All of them. From the exchange zones, even the rare elements, even the released elements, all of them are gone. That's why players really need to think about what elements they would pick during the drafting phase, because if they worsen their position for the terraforming order to pick the rare element and then they would not be able to use that rare element, it's a wasted action, it's the worst position for the terraforming order because of nothing. Beautiful, beautiful, elegant design of this game. Really love it. The game would continue with the next round and with subsequent rounds until at least one of the players terraforms 7 or more tiles. After that round, the game would be over and we would have the final scoring. In addition to the victory points accumulated during the game, the players would score victory points based on the number of tiles of a specific terrain type they have terraformed. So for example, if a player would terraform 3 plain tiles, he would score 3 victory points. If he would terraform 4 river tiles, he would score additional 10 victory points. If players would terraform at least 1 tile of each type, they would score additional 5 victory points. And finally, the game awards points for the largest contiguous area of the terraformed tiles. The player with the largest contiguous area of his own terraformed tiles would score the most victory points, then the second player with the second largest area would score the second most victory points, and so on and so forth. In a 2-player game, you can only score 3 victory points. In a 5-player game, the player with the largest area would score 12 victory points. So the way the final scoring is designed really affects the strategies. Players can go for adjacent tiles, for contiguous areas, they can score victory points during the game, they can score victory points for large contiguous areas at the end of the game, or you can go for high value tiles, you can go for mountains or rivers, but those tiles can be scattered across the board, or you can go for the combination of a few high value tiles and then some contiguous areas and some scorings from adjacent tiles. There are many ways how to win this game. So the strategy that you decide to pursue determines the tiles that you want to terraform during the terraforming phase, and that determines the elements that you would wish to pick during the drafting phase. But you have to react to other players, because if they follow the same strategy, you have to react. You either have to keep ahead of them during the terraforming phase, you have to go earlier, you have to reserve the tile they need, or you just switch to another strategy. So much interactivity in this game, so much to think about. It's not a rocket science, you don't have to calculate like in chess so many moves ahead, but you have to watch what other players are doing. So really, so much interactivity in this game, love it. So let's do some quick summary and some final thoughts for this game, and we'll start with the theme. This is an abstract strategy game with some theme pasted on it, and that's it. It's not a bad thing. I really like the way it is. It's an abstract strategy game. If you want to see some theme in it, it is there, but it's not important. I mean, this is really an abstract strategy game. Then, difficulty. What I really like about this game is that it's very simple and very easy to teach even the non-gamers, even the family members. This is really an easy game to teach. Way more difficult to master how to play the game really well, but easy to teach. Strategy. You need to have a strategy for the game. It's not chess, as I said. You don't have to calculate many moves ahead. But you have to have some plan and you have to think strategically for the game. You have to have some long-term vision and you need to watch what other players are doing. So there is some strategy. It's not super heavy, as I said, like a medium weight strategy game, but going without a strategy, you will probably not win this game. Luck, very little, if any. Yes, there is some luck in what kind of elements, what type of elements are drawn for each drafting phase, or what tiles are drawn for adding to the board, but it's a very little, I mean, very small amount of luck. Definitely, luck is not something which determines the outcome of the game, so no. It helps the variability, but definitely not a decisive factor. Interaction, super high. I mean, full score for me. I haven't played a game so much interactive as this one, so that says everything. Perfect score for the interaction. Replayability, the same, high score for replayability, because every time you play this game, it's going to be different. This game doesn't have or at least I haven't played it enough to find some dominant strategy, but I think even if there would be a dominant strategy, more players would follow the strategy. You have to react to what other players are doing. So if there are more players going for the same strategy, just do something else and probably you will win. So every time you play it, it's going to be different. Scalability also very high. The game scales really well from 2 players to 5 players. It plays slightly differently with 5 players than with 2 players, especially due to tactics and strategy. In a 2-player game, yes, the board is smaller, but it's more easier to predict what one other opponent will be doing than in a 5-player game where you don't have a clue what 4 other opponents will be doing during their turns. So in terms of tactics and strategy, it plays slightly differently, which is fine, but the game is same fun, engaging, interactive, in the same way for 2 players as it is for 5 players. And then downtime, almost no downtime for me, at least for me. The drafting phase can be a little prone to analysis paralysis because you have to think about what you're doing and what you're going to pick. But even if I make my selection and then there will be 4 other players doing their selection, I personally still think about what's the next pick. I'm watching other players. I need to watch what they're doing. I need to see what they're picking. I need to think about my position. So even if it's not my turn, I'm still involved in the game. I'm engaged, and as I said, I personally have absolutely no downtime in this game, which is fantastic. If it's 2-player game, whether it's 2-player game, whether it's 5-player game, I don't have the downtimes. So many high scores and so many positives about this game. I'm so excited about it. Don't forget, early September this year on a Kickstarter. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.